A man sits at a wooden table in a damp, windowless room in ancient Alexandria. The flame of an olive oil lamp flickering against the stone walls, or a reference textbook. You have the life of Jesus at the front. You have the history of the early church in the middle. His focus shrinks from the cathedral down to the individual. Timothy, Titus, Philemon. These are the pastoral epistles. The architecture of the New Testament narrows drastically, passing from the public arena into the private hands of the men who must carry the blueprint forward. Paul knows he is about to die, and the structure he spent his life building is suddenly vulnerable to false teachers, political persecution, and internal rot. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. Paul is writing his very last known words to a timid, young pastor stationed in the overwhelming pagan epicenter of Ephesus, and he gives him an urgent, final command. And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others. The English word translated "entrust" is the Greek paratithemi. It appears 31 times in the New Testament, and its range is far wider and heavier than a simple verbal instruction. The root comes from the prefix para, meaning alongside, and the verb tithemi, meaning to place or to lay down. In the ancient world, this was not a casual word. It was a strict banking and legal term. It meant to deposit a priceless, irreplaceable treasure into the vault of another person, holding them legally and morally accountable for its safe return. You have a stack of letters from Paul shoved in sequentially by size longest to shortest. And then you have a terrifying, it is the exact same Greek word Jesus cries out with his dying, suffocating breath on the cross. In Luke 23:46, Father, into your hands, I paratithemi, commit my spirit. That root changes everything about how we read these pastoral letters. The gospel is not an academic curriculum. It is a sacred deposit. Paul is transferring the living, breathing treasure of the apostolic testimony from his chained, scarred hands into the shaking hands of the next generation. He is writing a manual on how to guard the vault. He is telling Titus how to appoint elders who will not compromise the deposit in Crete. He is telling Timothy how to discipline wolves who try to steal the treasure in Ephesus. He is writing to Philemon, demanding that he look at a runaway slave named Onesimus and welcome him back not as stolen property, but as a blood-bought brother. The architecture has been designed. The walls have been framed, and the heavy keys have been placed into the hands of the pastors. But as the first century draws to a close, a new and devastating threat emerges from within the church itself, a temptation that threatens to pull the entire structure back into the dust of the Old Covenant. And the only way to save the building is to construct a massive, soaring bridge, apocalyptic fever dream tacked onto the back. And it does look like a simple catalog sometimes. But if you look closer, the temple is still standing. The priests are still walking barefoot across the cold stone. The silver trumpets are still sounding over the city. The blood is still running in thick grooves down the bronze altar in Jerusalem. It is the late 60s AD. The Jewish believers are exhausted. They are being stripped of their property. They are being pushed to the margins of society. The Roman pressure is suffocating, and the temptation is pulling at them. Go back. Go back to the visible. Go back to the incense you can smell. Go back to the sacrifices you can see. Go back to the heavy, embroidered curtain that separates the holy place. The ancient rituals are legal under Roman law. They are protected. They feel safe. Then, an anonymous document arrives. The book of Hebrews is dropped into the New Testament architecture like a massive, load-bearing bridge spanning a deep canyon. It connects the ancient, bloody rituals of Leviticus to the eternal reality of the resurrected Christ. The author uses rapid fire, escalating logic. He takes every single sacred object of the Jewish faith and systematically proves it was only ever pointing forward. Jesus is greater than the angels. Jesus is greater than Moses. Jesus offers a better covenant. Jesus provides a better sacrifice. At the exact sequence of how these 27 books are laid out, at the progression of thought From Matthew to Revelation, the Old Covenant was not a failure. It was a shadow. You do not stare at a shadow on the wall. When the physical body has finally walked into the room, Hebrews argues that retreating to the temple is not just a compromise. It is a spiritual catastrophe. The author forces the readers to look up. The earthly high priest had to enter the holy place every single year with the blood of a goat, trembling, hoping he would not die. The heavenly high priest walked into the throne room of the universe with his own blood. And he sat down. The earthly priest never sat. His work was never done. Jesus sat down. The debt is erased. The veil is torn. The access is permanent. Hebrews seals off the exit. It forces the believer to stand firm in the finished work of grace, refusing to let them crawl back into the machinery of the law. But a theology built purely on absolute, finished grace creates a new vulnerability in the human heart. If the work is totally complete in heaven, what is left to do on earth? If faith alone saves you, why does your behavior even matter? A twisted version of Paul's theology starts to circulate, whispering that grace is a license for apathy. You start to see something the filing cabinet theory completely misses. The sequence of the New Testament is not a chronological accident. The architecture anticipates this exact human loophole, and it swings a heavy, blunt instrument directly at the believer's head. You sit in a comfortable chair, maybe holding a warm cup of coffee, and you nod along to the high theology of Paul. You love the idea that grace is entirely free, that the legal debt has been canceled, and that your salvation is safely secured in a heavenly vault. But human nature is remarkably skilled at turning a divine gift into a comfortable excuse, allowing you to consume endless sermons while your actual life remains stubbornly unchanged. You can fill your head with the theological definitions of justification, but still walk past a hungry neighbor, scream at your family behind closed doors, and harbor a quiet, bitter resentment in your chest. The architecture of the New Testament sees you doing this, and so it places a cluster of specific letters right near the end of the collection: James, Peter, John, and Jude, to act as a violent, necessary counterweight. They are the general epistles, and they do not care about your intellectual agreements. James looks at your theoretical faith and demands to see the calluses on your hands. He writes with the blunt, sharp tone of an ancient prophet, reminding you that even the demons have perfect theology. They believe in one God, and they shudder in terror. It is an architecture. It is a carefully constructed blueprint designed to take a human mind from absolute ignorance of who God is. He points to the physical tongue inside your mouth, describing it as a restless evil, a tiny spark that can set an entire forest of relationships on fire in a matter of seconds. Faith is not a mental checklist. It is a kinetic force. If your theology does not move your feet, feed the poor, and bridle your mouth. James says your faith is a lifeless corpse. Then Peter steps in, writing to you not as a comfortable citizen, but as an exile living in a hostile, unpredictable world. You are feeling the cultural temperature drop, sensing the growing hostility against anyone who holds to an ancient biblical ethic. Peter tells you to expect the fiery trial, to embrace the friction, and to live with such undeniable, beautiful goodness that your harshest critics are silenced by the sheer weight of your daily character. John brings you back to the stark reality of love, systematically stripping away your spiritualized vocabulary. He tells you that if you claim to walk in the light but carry a secret, cold hatred for your brother, you are still wandering in absolute darkness. You cannot claim an invisible love for an invisible God, while manifesting visible contempt for the physical people made in his exact image. And Jude arrives with a dark, urgent warning, all the way to complete spiritual maturity in the midst of suffering. The early church fathers who recognized and preserved this order against the deceptive voices that slip into your feed and your mind undetected, turning the grace of God into a convenient excuse for hidden immorality. These letters are the heavy anchors of Christian practice. They prevent the soaring theology of the New Testament from floating away into the clouds. dragging the reality of the gospel violently down into your bank account, your calendar, and your private conversations. They demand that the internal transformation produces an external, undeniable reality. The walls are built, the theological bridge is secure, and the daily actions of the inhabitants are finally aligned. But every house is eventually surrounded by night. And when the empire finally turns its full, crushing weight against the church, proper ethics and historical theology are no longer enough to keep the bleeding believers from total despair. They do not need another instruction manual. The architecture needs one final feature. An old man stands on the jagged volcanic rock of a penal colony. The wind off the Aegean Sea whips a coarse cloak against his frail body. His hands, the same hands that once touched the pierced side of the resurrected Christ, are weathered. Scared and trembling, he is the last one left. The year is roughly AD 95. The Emperor Domitian has declared himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. We're not just organizing a library. They were mapping out an initiation. They understood that you cannot build the walls before you pour. Refusal to burn a pinch of incense to his statue means exile, or the blood-soaked sand of the arena. The church is bleeding out. The believers are hiding in shadows. And John, the beloved disciple, is banished to Patmos, effectively buried alive on a rock in the middle of the sea. Then, the air behind him shatters. He hears a voice like the deafening blast of a war trumpet. He turns, and the veil of the material world is ripped violently in half. He falls to the dirt as though he were dead. This is the book of Revelation. The Greek word is apocalypsis, meaning the lifting of the curtain. Modern readers often treat this final scroll like a paranoid puzzle book, trying to decode helicopters, microchips, and geopolitical timelines. But the bleeding, terrified believers in the first century did not need a puzzle. They needed a guarantee. Revelation is not a crystal ball designed to terrify you. It is a balcony designed to steady you. John looks through the torn sky and sees Rome for what it really is. It is not an invincible, eternal empire. It is a temporary, grotesque beast dragging itself out of the dark water. He sees the suffering of his murdered friends. The foundation. You cannot survive the storm before you understand the anchor. If you read these books in the exact order they are bound together, their blood is not soaked meaninglessly into the Roman dirt. It is collected. It is crying out from directly beneath a golden altar, in the throne room of the universe. The ultimate power in the cosmos is not a Caesar on a marble throne holding a sword. The ultimate power is a lamb standing in the center of heaven, looking as though it had been slain. The architecture of the New Testament reaches its absolute pinnacle. You have climbed from the foundation of the Gospels, through the expanding hallways of Acts, past the heavy timber of Paul's theology, and you are finally standing on the roof. The story does not end in a disembodied, floating spiritual realm. It ends with the skies splitting open, and the physical dwelling place of God crashing down to a remade earth. A city with foundations. A city where the gates are never shut. The 27 books form a complete, impenetrable fortress of truth. But as you step back from this cosmic vision and look at the structure as a whole, a second, deeply personal pattern emerges from the floor plan. The architecture does not just trace the history of the ancient church. It traces the exact, unavoidable trajectory of your own soul. You are not just reading history. You are walking through the floor plan of a transformed life. You step through the front door. The architecture of these 27 books holds a mirror up to the human experience. When you strip away the historical dates, the Roman political context, and the geographical maps, the sequence of the canon reveals a second, hidden blueprint. It is not just the chronological history of how a movement expanded from Jerusalem to Rome. The sequence is the psychological anatomy of a single conversion. Think about how a human soul actually wakes up. It never starts with an abstract understanding of systematic theology. It always starts with a confrontation, a sudden, jarring encounter with a person who demands a verdict. That is the gospel phase. You collide with the claims of Jesus of Nazareth. You are forced to answer the question, who do you say that I am? Are you a lunatic? A liar? Or exactly who you claim to be? Once the verdict is decided, the internal combustion happens. The spirit moves in. The old addictions shatter. A violent, rushing wind clears out the dead space of your life, and you feel the raw, untamed momentum of a new reality. That is your book of Acts. It is the honeymoon phase of faith. You are moving. You are zealous. But momentum cannot sustain a life. Over the span of 3 decades, eventually, the emotional high fades, and you hit the crushing complexity of marriage, failure, and cultural resistance. The raw experience demands a framework. You need theology. You need the heavy timber to stabilize your wavering emotions. That is your Pauline phase. He runs a calloused finger over the frayed edge of a papyrus scroll. The parchment is stained with sea salt of the Gospels, where the claims of a resurrected king demand a verdict. You walk into the hallway of Acts, where the power, you sit in Romans. You absorb the logic. You build the load-bearing walls inside your mind so that your faith does not collapse the moment you lose your job or bury a parent. Then, you age. The public arena of your youth slowly shrinks to a smaller circle of influence. You are no longer trying to change the entire world. You are trying to faithfully disciple a few younger people. Passing the baton before you are gone, you enter the pastoral epistles. The focus shifts to the sacred deposit, the paratimi. You hit seasons of deep, exhausted temptation, where the old, safe compromises pull at you. You enter Hebrews, looking back at the superiority of Christ to keep from sliding backward into the dark. You face the brutal necessity of actually living out your beliefs when no one is watching. You enter the general epistles. You force your theology down into your bank accounts, your tongue, and your private behavior. And finally, you realize the world around you is broken beyond human repair. The systems are corrupt. The final enemy is approaching, and you need the ultimate reassurance that the pain of this temporary exile is not the final word. You enter Revelation, looking toward the horizon, waiting for the sky to split. The pattern is fixed. It is the inescapable sequence of spiritual maturation. The early church fathers did not invent this blueprint. They merely recognized the divine design that had already been laid down by the Spirit. Of that resurrection explodes into the ancient world. You sit in the heavy, load-bearing rooms of Paul's letters, where the theology is hammered. And when you finally see the whole structure at once, the magnitude of what you hold in your hands becomes almost overwhelming. The tax collector traced the ancient bloodlines, and the true king was revealed. The physician recorded the rushing wind, and the fire spread to the Gentile world. The Pharisee hammered heavy logic into the pagan mind, and the walls of our theology were secured. The aging mentor handed off the sacred deposit, and the treasure was guarded for the next generation. The anonymous writer sealed off the exits to the old temple, and the finished work of the high priest stood supreme. The earthly brother demanded calluses on our hands, and our grace was dragged out into the dirt. The exiled disciple looked through a torn sky on a volcanic rock, and the Lamb was standing in the center of the throne. 27 books, one architect. But here is the part I keep coming back to. The word Paul used in that dark, damp Mamertine dungeon while he shivered in the cold, waiting for the executioner, paratithemi, the sacred deposit. He did not view the New Testament as a collection of interesting philosophical ideas. He viewed it as a priceless treasure, placed directly into his bleeding hands by the resurrected Christ, demanding to be guarded and handed down. If you are in a season where you're into the framework of your mind, and you end up on a balcony in Revelation, looking out at the consummation of all human history, faith feels fragile. Where the cultural pressure is suffocating, and you are tempted to deconstruct the house just to see if the foundation holds. Look at the architecture. You do not have to build the foundation from scratch. You do not have to invent the theology. The house has already been built. The walls have already withstood 2,000 years of empire, persecution, and rot. The deposit has already been placed into your hands. You just have to stand in it. If this opened up the architecture of the text for you, subscribe, leave a comment. Even one word helps. Share this with someone who feels lost in the sequence of their own spiritual journey. Pray for us as we keep digging into these ancient blueprints. And may the God who designed this massive, unshakable fortress, who oversaw every stone and every syllable, meet you in whatever room you are standing in right now and walk you safely all the way to the balcony. The order itself is a theology. To feel the weight of this design, you cannot start in the middle of the house. You have to start where the dirt is moved and the first stones are laid. You have to step into the foundation. And that foundation begins with a hated tax collector who picks up a pen to prove a highly controversial point to his own people. The architecture begins with 4 separate doors into the same room. Most ancient biographies give you one perspective, one author, one timeline, but the New Testament opens with a deliberate, stereoscopic view. 4 distinct accounts, 4 different authors: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They are not a repetitive redundancy. They are a 4-dimensional cornerstone. A foundation must bear the weight of everything built on top of it. If the foundation cracks, the theology of Paul collapses. If the foundation sinks, the hope of revelation shatters, worn thin by the thumbs of people who were eventually fed to lions or crucified along Roman roads. He picks up a reed pen. So, the early church placed 4 massive, load-bearing pillars at the very front of the canon. Matthew writes to the Hebrew mind. He builds a bridge out of the ancient past. He opens with a dense, rhythmic genealogy. He pulls the thread of prophecy through the centuries, proving that the man from Nazareth is the rightful heir to David's throne. He points to the law. He points to the temple. He anchors the building to the bedrock of Judaism. Mark writes to the Roman mind. He strips away the genealogies. He drops you into the dirt. The pace is breathless. The Greek word euthys immediately fires like a piston, appearing over 40 times. Jesus is moving. Jesus is healing. Jesus is bleeding. Mark does not give you a king on a throne. He gives you a suffering servant with dust on his sandals, rushing toward a cross. Luke writes to the Greek mind. He approaches the text with the sterile precision of a physician. He interviews the eyewitnesses. He names the Roman governors. He documents the exact historical coordinates, but his lens is pointed downward. He notices the outcasts. He records the women. He sees the lepers. Luke gives you the perfect, compassionate human. And then there is John. John writes to the universal mind. He does not start in a manger in Bethlehem. He does not start with Abraham. He is not writing a new theology. He is not drafting a sermon. He is compiling a list. The year is AD 367. He starts outside of time itself. In the beginning was the Word. He paints in stark, high-contrast colors, light and darkness, water and wine, flesh and spirit. John pulls you off the dirt roads of Galilee and takes you into the cosmic throne room. 4 accounts, 4 lenses. The king, the servant, the man, the God. If you only had Matthew, the church remains a Jewish sect. If you only had Mark, you lose the ancient prophecies. If you only had Luke, you miss the cosmic scale of the incarnation. If you only had John, the story floats away into philosophical abstraction. But bound together, they lock into place. They give the human mind nowhere to hide. You cannot dismiss Jesus as a mere myth, because Luke gives you the Roman dates. You cannot dismiss him as just a good teacher, because John shows you his pre-existence. The cornerstone is set. The resurrection is recorded. The room is built. But a foundation by itself is just a concrete slab. A story about a resurrected king locked in the past does not change the Roman Empire. The static truth must become kinetic energy. The spark has to hit the dry brush. And that brings you to the single most dangerous book in the library. And the Bishop Athanasius is writing his annual Easter letter to the churches. In it, he will formally list the 27 books, a group of fishermen, former tax collectors, and women huddle in an upper room in Jerusalem. The stone walls are thick. The doors are shut. They are waiting for a promise they barely understand. And then, the air pressure in the room suddenly drops. A sound like a violent, rushing wind tears through the space. Something resembling tongues of fire rests on their heads. They stumble out into the sunlit, crowded streets of the city, opening their mouths and speaking in languages they have never studied. The spark hits the dry brush. The Jesus movement ceases to be a local Galilean phenomenon. This is the Book of Acts, penned by the physician Luke as Volume 2 of his historical project. It sits exactly where it must in the architecture of the text. It is the hinge of history. It is the massive, swinging joint that connects the life of Christ to the life of the church. Imagine, for a moment, reading the New Testament without this specific scroll. You would turn the page from the end of the Gospel of John, where Jesus is eating roasted fish on a quiet beach in Israel with a handful of Jewish followers. You would flip the page and immediately crash into the book of Romans. You would suddenly be reading a dense, sweeping theological treatise that make up what we now call the New Testament. 27 separate documents, written by fishermen, a tax collector, written to a mixed congregation of Jews and Gentiles living in the political epicenter of the pagan world. The whiplash would be absolute. How did the message get from a rural fishing village to the shadow of Caesar's palace? Who are these Gentiles? And who is this man named Paul writing to them? Acts answers the question. Acts is not a museum exhibit of early church history. It is the tactical operations manual of a new kingdom. Over the span of 28 chapters, the narrative drives relentlessly outward. You can feel the dust and the danger on every page. Stephen is dragged outside the city walls, the crack of stones against his ribs, echoing as he prays for his murderers. A brilliant, violent Pharisee named Saul is thrown to the dirt on the road to Damascus, blinded by a light brighter than the midday sun. Chains rattle and fall to the stone floor in a Philippian jail at midnight. Grain ships are splintered to pieces on the hidden reefs of Malta in the freezing rain. The physical body of Jesus has left the earth, but the breath of God has fallen on his people. The temple is no longer a building in Jerusalem. The temple is walking around in the Roman marketplace. But pure momentum is not enough. Once the fire spreads across the Mediterranean, a Greek physician, and a Pharisee with a prison record. They were scratched into existence in damp prison cells. It hits the complicated reality of human nature. The new believers in Corinth start sleeping with temple prostitutes. The church in Galatia starts demanding circumcision. The Christians in Rome start fighting over dietary laws. The raw, explosive power of Acts has to be translated into a systematic theology. The foundation is laid, and the walls are framed. But now the interior has to be built. The new believers need heavy logic to ground their ecstatic experiences. And to do that, God recruits the man who used to hold the coats of the people throwing the stones. The letters of Paul arrive like heavy timber dropped on a construction site. Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians. They are arranged by size in your Bible, longest to shortest. 9 massive documents written to 7 geographical house churches. But this structural sequence creates a perfect theological descent. You open the thickest scroll, Romans. You are reading the constitution of the human soul. Paul builds a staggering, ironclad argument about human depravity, divine grace, and the precise mechanics of justification. The logic is relentless. The scope is total. Then you crack the wax seal on 1 Corinthians. The high theology suddenly hits the pavement. People are suing each other in Roman courts. Factions are screaming at each other. Believers are getting drunk at the communion table. The church is a chaotic, breathing mess on the decks of rocking cargo ships. and in rented rooms across the Roman Empire over the span of 50 years. Paul applies the rigid theology of Romans to the fractured reality of daily life. Then, you unroll Galatians. The tone shifts entirely. The ink is practically burning a hole through the papyrus. Paul is furious. The believers are trying to earn their salvation by retreating back into ancient Jewish law. He shuts it down. He argues. He pleads. He commands. You move into Ephesians, and the camera zooms out to the cosmic, eternal purpose of the church. You open Philippians, and you hear the metallic clink of Roman chains as a prisoner writes about joy. You reach Colossians, and you are handed the supreme, unrivaled image of a Christ who holds the physical atoms of the universe together. You finish the church letters with Thessalonians, turning your face to the horizon, waiting for the sky to split and the king to return. These documents are not a random stack of ancient mail. They are the load-bearing walls of the Christian mind. If seeing this hidden architecture makes the text feel alive to you for the very first time, you're exactly who this channel is for. Drop a thought in the comments and hit subscribe, because every week we go deeper into the text than you knew was possible. So Paul takes the raw, explosive experience of Acts and bolts it securely to the floor. He gives the newly converted pagan world a vocabulary for their salvation. Most people assume the New Testament is just a chronological filing cabinet. We assume it is arranged like a modern anthology. He explains what the blood on the cross actually accomplished in the heavenly courtroom. He defines grace. He maps out the invisible gifts of the Spirit. He explains how a Roman master and a Greek slave should look at each other as equals. He details exactly how to dismantle human anxiety. He builds the intellectual framework. He puts a solid theological roof over the ecstatic, wind-blown experiences of the early church. But theological frameworks are always tested in the dark. What happens when the structure is built, but the architects start to face the executioner's sword? What happens when the Roman Empire stops ignoring this new sect and decides to systematically exterminate it? The sweeping, panoramic letters to the massive crowds are no longer enough. Paul's focus has to drastically narrow. The audience of thousands must shrink down to one. An old man sits on the dirt floor of the Mamertine dungeon in Rome. The air smells of sewage and damp earth. There is a single circular grate in the stone ceiling where the guards drop the prisoners. Serving as the only source of pale, creeping light, the man is shivering, writing a request for a heavy winter coat, waiting for the inevitable swing of a Roman executioner's blade. He is writing his final letters, but he is not addressing the massive crowds in Ephesus or the loud, chaotic congregations in Corinth anymore.